This is level 1 of the CFA program, the topic on ethics and professional standards, and the third video on this very long reading of guidance for standards 1 through 7 and ethics applications. You've seen these learning outcome statements before, so let's go ahead and get right to standard 3, duties to clients and prospective clients. Notice that the Institute has divided this into 5 components. So let's go ahead and get started with loyalty, prudence, and care. And I call your attention to the first couple of paragraphs in this reading. The first paragraph talks about loyalty, and this is super important. The loyalty is to the client and or the prospective client. And in that paragraph, you'll read terms that sound like best interest of clients. In the second paragraph, there's a discussion on prudence, and I love this word that the Institute uses, caution. Caution in here. So, of course, we don't want to just jump in and say, oh, I heard a rumor about this particular investment. Let's go ahead and pile on. So we want to make decisions that are in the best interest of our clients, and we want to do so with caution. And then the word care is kind of thrown in and out of both of those 2 paragraphs. But then the Institute says something like this. Hey, look, of course, we want our clients to be at the front of our brains, but it doesn't preclude our obligation to previous standards. Remember, we had one on knowledge of the law. So we can't put our clients in front of the law. That's important. So make sure you're aware of a potential exam question when there might be a conflict of interest. And we'll talk about conflicts as we go along in these 7 recordings. All right, so what does this tell us in the handbook? Reasonable care. Those of you who watched my videos in level 1 know that I love the word reasonable. It's a great word to use and to apply to the decision making in your personal life. What's reasonable, right? You know, what could any kind of a person say is reasonable? Yeah, exercise prudent judgment. So look in the orange box there. What does this mean? Of course, the client's interests always come first, comma, I don't have a comma here on the slide, but comma, you know, let's make sure that we're within the legal framework here. Now, the next question is, who is the client? I mean, a lot of times it's super obvious, right? I mean, I have my students in my graduate and undergraduate investments class, they create a fictional client. And it's usually a young individual because they're young individuals, or it's a married couple. And so it's super obvious that they're the client. But then I give them the example. I say, suppose that you have a client who is wheeled into your office on a gurney, and there's all these different machines hooked up to the client, and the doctor's standing there and says, hey, here's my patient, he or she can't talk, but they have $100 million, and they're only going to live for the next, 1 minute or 5 minutes. Here's our $100 million. We want you to manage this portfolio. And so I asked my students the question. I said, who's the client? Is it, and what's the time frame? You know, is it a really short time window? I mean, imagine putting down on a policy statement that the investment horizon is 11 minutes because our client is ready to die. And of course, some of my students will raise their hand and say something like, well, you know what, Jim, who is the beneficiary? So that's important. And that's kind of that first arrow point example here about a pension fund. Who is the client? Of course, if you have an individual client who's on his or her deathbed, then you have to manage it for the beneficiaries of that client. And the same thing with a pension fund. Now, you also have to be careful. Look at that second arrow point about a specific mandate. So if there's a specific mandate that says something like, you know what, I want you to go ahead, I want you to do this, whatever this is. And this could be like, you know, a passive investment to mimic Jim's broad equity index fund, you know, so that's the mandate. It doesn't really matter what I'm doing, what Jim is. It doesn't really matter what anyone else is doing. So that's why we have the word none down there. So make sure that you can differentiate between, you know, an obvious client and then maybe not an obvious client, which I always tell my students, think of them as like an indirect client, which is a beneficiary, and then a specific mandate. Now, I've said this a handful of times, and I'm going to repeat it here, that in level 3, we talk at length. In fact, the focus is on the policy statement. In level 1, we do a little bit. Level 2, we do a little bit more. But of course, this standard on loyalty, prudence, and care must be in line with the investment policy statement. And of course, in the policy statement, there's going to be a strategic asset allocation, which, and let me just make up a simple one here that might say something like, 10% of the portfolio is invested in very liquid assets, 50% in equities, and then what does that leave us? 40% in fixed income securities. So we have that outlined in the policy statement. And so loyalty, prudence, and care means that when we're making a decision on, let's suppose we want to add a municipal bond to the portfolio, we need to consider how it relates to the entire portfolio. And of course, we had great discussions in some reading back in level 1, and we'll do this in level 2 and level 3 as well, that one of the great ways to consider the entire portfolio is to look at things like a correlation coefficient. And if you know the correlation coefficients between and among the different asset classes, then you'll be able to make, what did we say earlier? A prudent decision with caution and care, so that it reflects the clients' risk and return objectives that are outlined in the policy statement, but also all of their 5 constraints. Now, how about this concept of soft dollars? So let me give you just a quick example. Let's suppose that you're the wealth manager, and you have a client, and your client says something like, "Hey, I want you to buy one share of a stock that's trading for $100. Let's just make up a simple example here. So you call me, so I'm some kind of a broker, and I'll say to you, you know what, I'll charge you $5 for that transaction. But my cousin is a broker over there, and you call my cousin, and my cousin says something like, you know what, I'll charge you $10, but I will give you access to our software that's going to be able to more efficiently allocate between and among all your different asset classes." And so the question then becomes, do you hire me for $5? I mean, that $5 sounds cheap. Or do you hire my cousin? What did I say earlier? $10. 5 sounds like less than $10. But then you have to decide whether or not it's worth paying my cousin that extra $5 to get those extra services. So that extra $5, those are known as soft dollars. Now, of course, this is why the Institute, and I love this part of the program, it requires you to go back and learn economics, both at the macro level and at the micro level. And so the decision comes down to, what did I say, $5 extra for my cousin? Marginal cost, marginal benefits. That's why the Institute, look at that second point there. The best price and the best execution might not be me for $5. It might be my cousin for $10. Now, what about proxy voting? I get this all the time because through my college, we have the TIAA. And so I have, a handful of these mutual funds, and so I get these statements in the mail saying, "Okay, what do you want TIA to do for voting on this particular thing?" And like most people, I just go ahead and chunk it into the garbage can, and I let my pension fund manager make that economic decision about who to vote for or whatever's on the agenda. And so notice what we have here, that of course all of us have a responsibility to vote our proxies for our candidates, which is in the, what did I say earlier in that very first paragraph of this reading, the best interests of the client. But what the Institute does they do add the economic benefit to the client in this section. So let's go ahead and take a look at an example. Here we have a wealth manager. That second sentence is probably important. Percentage of his management fees is derived from trading commissions. Okay, so now we need to scratch our head and say, all right, now, what are we doing here? What's the best thing to do for this wealth manager, John Taylor? The best thing for John is for him to go ahead and just have anarchy in trading, right? Let's just trade everything. Let's just trade today, buy and sell and buy and sell. All right. So we're not surprised to read the next sentence. Taylor trades excessively in each of his client trading accounts, but the trades are appropriate and in line with the client's asset allocations. So you see what we're trying to do with this question? We're trying to lead you down a path that says something like, oh, if the trades are appropriate, then that's okay. But clearly that last paragraph that last sentence tells us that exceeds what is required to implement the client's objectives. All right, so here's this question that I've warned you about before. Do Taylor's actions violate this standard? And your choices are yes for this reason, yes for that reason, no for this reason, no for that reason. It's good that you only have 3 choices. So hopefully you guys are probably all over this. So yeah, there's a violation because he uses client assets to benefit himself. All right, how about fair dealing here? What does this mean? That you have a handful of clients, let's say you have 100 clients, and you can't ask some of the clients to step forward and say, oh, I'm going to treat you a little bit better than I'm going to treat somebody else. So deal fairly and objectively with all clients. And I'll give you my professional analogy. My students always ask me questions like, oh, you probably just grade based on how much a student answers in class or what they did on the last exam. And I say, look, when I grade exams, when I give final grades, I have no idea who is the author of that paper. I have a rubric, I go through it, and if the student does this and this and this, they get full credit. If they make 90 out of 100 points, they earn a grade of A for the semester. And so that's my way of dealing fairly and objectively with all of my students. And of course, this applies to wealth management as well. Now look at that last teardrop point down there. Fair does not mean equally. Different levels of services are acceptable as long as everybody knows this. So you can have 100 clients, and you may treat them fairly, but you don't have to treat them equally, because you could say something to one client like, here, let me give you a silly example. If you come over and cut my grass, I'll spend another 1 hour working on your portfolio. That's a stupid example. But you can think of great examples where different levels of services are acceptable. Yeah, how about investment recommendations? We want to make certain that if we're a research analyst, or we have these analysts working for us, and they come and say, hey, you know what, we think that, what's that example of a company that I've used before? Jim's Concrete Company. We think Jim is really doing a great job. We think his stock is undervalued, et cetera, and so we're going to make a buy recommendation on Jim's Concrete Company, and we want to make certain that every client has the opportunity to react to our recommendation. Now, of course, sometimes the clients say, you know what, let's just go ahead, whatever you want to do, go ahead and do it. Just make sure that it's all the things that we've talked about. But some clients will want to have their own approval, because as you know, this is their money after all, and some clients want to know what's going on beforehand. Yeah, the Institute likes to ask these questions at the end of the readings on initial public offerings. And so there's no way that you should provide one particular client with a better access or a better opportunity to participate in an IPO. In fact, there's lots of academic research out there that shows something like, you know what, there are a bunch of IPOs that do really well in the first 2 or 3 or 5 or 7 days. But then after some extended time period, like 60 days, they all revert back to their regular old normal risk-adjusted rate of return. And so I usually tell students that, you know what, if you're really interested in an IPO, go ahead and buy 10 shares of it if you want. But please don't buy 90% of your portfolio. And then, of course, we talked about disclosure many times. All right, how about another example on fair dealing? All right, here we have an analyst emails all her clients about a change in her recommendation. All right, so 2 biggest clients, she calls her 2 biggest clients to review her conclusions and respond to any queries. Ooh, do these violate fair dealing? All right, so she calls two of her biggest clients to review her conclusions. I don't know. So what are our choices here? Yes, for some reason. No, we're kind of leaning towards no, but maybe there's discrimination in there. But I think we're okay with this because she emails all her clients. And all she does is pick up the phone and call two of the biggest clients because those big clients, they probably would like to have this conversation. But if that first sentence read something like Josephine emails a handful of her clients at 10 o'clock in the morning and then calls a couple of them at 10:30 in the morning and then emails everybody else at 12 o'clock, then that's probably not acceptable. All right, suitability. This makes perfect sense in the context of the policy statement. I tell my students this all the time. I say, look, your clients are going to come into your office, whether it's physical or Zoom related, and they're going to tell you about all the money that they have. But the most important part of this is that they're going to tell you about their goals, their aspirations, and their fears. And I tell the students that fear is among the biggest inputs to this whole concept of a policy statement. So it's our job to find assets and asset classes that are suitable, that match the client's risk and return objectives and all of those financial constraints. Now, of course, this is true as well for a specific mandate, and that specific mandate then has to be taken into consideration with the other components of the portfolio. So what do we have? We have a risk objective and we have a return objective because, essentially going back to Harry Markowitz in 1952, who operated in a two-space framework. You should remember efficient frontier conversations that we've had. You've got standard deviation on one axis and expected return on the other axis. So you have to match. And what does every client want? Every client would love to come in and say, all right, my return objective is 25% and I want a 2% standard deviation. And of course, those are not possible. That's why Harry Markowitz called those unattainable. I tell my students that's kind of like a fantasy world. All right, so in order to figure out the objectives, you need to have an interview with the client. And so this interview can take place, over several days or over a couple of weeks, but really you're getting to know the client and you have the ability then to assess the risk, you have the ability to assess timelines, you have the ability to assess tax implications and liquidity issues, and then unique circumstances. And when I have my students do a policy statement, I actually have them put together 6 constraints. That last constraint is a behavioral constraint because I want them to think about behavioral finance and cognitive errors and emotional biases as kind of their separate entity. But the Institute just lumps them in with unique circumstances. So be ready for a behavioral issue thrown into what the objective is. Notice what we have in bold there in that arrow point. Each IPS should be updated annually, or when there's kind of a life-changing event. Generally speaking, diversification, boy, we talked about that. I'll make sure the client knows the basics. I say this pretty regularly in recordings, at least I think I do, that part of the responsibility of a good wealth manager is to educate the client. And some clients are more willingly to that education process than others, but it's up to us to try to figure out ways to educate the client. And then we want to explain the risks inside of that. So let's look at a question here. So we have a portfolio worth $100,000. Father passed away and left him with $5 million. Well, all right, so that's a good thing, right? This is all good news. Let's see, the investment advisor has not made any changes to Layfield's policy statement. Same objectives, same constraints listed in the initial IPS. Well, of course, what you should immediately be thinking is that there's no possible way that the constraints, probably all of them, but at least the unique circumstance constraint, a sudden inflow of a tremendous amount of capital, that's probably should be listed somewhere in the unique constraint. But then, of course, Joseph, what is Joseph going to do with that $5 million inheritance? Well, I don't know, does he have to pay taxes on it? But he's probably going to buy a house or a car or do something. So there's all sorts of liquidity outflows there. All right, so what's the question here? Has the analyst violated this standard on suitability? Once again, we have some choices. No, because of a reason. Yes, because of a different reason. But clearly, there's a violation here because there's no updated portfolio. And in fact, I would make the claim that this would be the correct answer, even if there wasn't a $5 million inheritance, because it says over 2 years, the advisor has not made any changes. And so the Institute wants us to do this annually. All right, how about performance presentation? So here's the deal. Boy, we're really tempted to pick and choose, right? We want to say something like, you know what? I played 18 holes of golf yesterday and I birdied 2 and 9 and 14. So I'm a great golfer, or I had a great day, or whatever that is. Let's evaluate my golfing skills based on 3 out of 18 holes. And whenever I tell my cousin that about my round of golf, he always immediately says, what did you do on the other 15 holes? And I always say something like, who cares? I'm not a professional golfer. I peaked on those 3 holes, and that's the way I'm going to report it to anybody who really is interested in listening to me babble on about golf. But of course, as good financial analysts and those who are living in accord with this performance presentation would report all 18 holes. In fact, my cousin would say something like, you know what, you need to put in the times you hit it into the water, the times when you sliced it into the woods, the times when you hacked it over there, when you almost killed your caddy, et cetera, et cetera. So what are the bolded words there? Fair, accurate, and complete. That makes perfect sense here. All right, so what are the objectives here? We can't misstate performance, so there's probably going to be a discussion on risk because, suppose the client has a return objective of 5% and has a mandate that says something like, hey, you know what, invest most of the money in treasury securities and give me 5%. And so we deliver 6%, and the client is delighted, but we invested in equity securities and alternative investments and all sorts of crazy stuff. And our standard deviation was 22% or some big number. So we need to make sure we match the risk and return objective as it relates to performance presentation. So we need to say something like, okay, here's the standard deviation, or correlation coefficient, or value at risk, or however you want to measure the variability in returns. All right, past performance, so we need to use multi-year performance data, not only the past year, right? That goes back to my saying, in my last round of golf, I had 3 birdies. Fair and complete performance, so we need to disclose not only that prior performance, but also any fees that are involved and taxes. Look at this last one here. Do not state or imply the ability to guarantee a return. You can't say something like, you know what, I birdied the last 3 holes of my round today, so I'm probably going to birdie the first 3 holes when I start playing tomorrow. So you can't have any kind of a hint that your skill set that you are learning from the CFA program is going to enable you to be better than that person over there. All right, what types of performance presentation is required? Now, we talked about this during our discussion and our reading on performance, right? We could show a holding period return. That's probably not any good. We could show some type of a capital gain. That's probably not complete. What do we want to do? We want to show total returns, and we want to use a geometric return. Remember, we talked about geometric returns as they're an example. The most clear example of a geometric return is the internal rate of return of an investment. Now, we might not want to go ahead and tell our audience what that geometric return is and how it was calculated, we might just want to say total return. So that's that first great point there. Consider audience sophistication. Yeah, similar portfolios, that makes sense. Include any terminated accounts. We don't want to say something like, oh, I made 7 bogeys on the first 7 holes, but I used my driver on all of those holes, but I've thrown that driver away, so I'm never going to use that driver again. Well, you know what? It was still your swing, so it's still my decision making that caused those accounts to be terminated. And then I can't emphasize enough, disclose. If you ever get the exam question that says something like, oh, we don't need to disclose it, well, that's probably a clear indication that that answer is not correct. All right, here we have another example question here. Portfolio manager, several funds, different investment strategies. Okay, this is all right. Olivia only mentions the better performing fund. All right, so we probably don't like that. So Olivia's action either violates or does not violate. And so I think this is a super easy question here, right? So don't be tempted to answer B or C because she mentioned one of its funds or she didn't lie about the performance, right? She didn't say she overperformed. She just didn't fully disclose. So remember, the sins of omission are probably equal to the sins of commission. And then this last component, confidentiality. We talked a little bit about this in one of those earlier recordings under the standards. Of course, we need to make sure that we hold all of our information and data confidential unless, of course, I said this earlier, it's some kind of illegal activity. If disclosure is required by law, or sometimes the client or the prospective client will permit the disclosure of that information. All right, avoid sharing client information except to colleagues working on the same project. All right, so that's important. So I can envision an exam question where you're sharing information with your colleagues and the institute is going to make it sound like this is an okay thing, but these colleagues have to be working on the same project. Members should cooperate with any investigation by the CFA Institute. Okay, that makes perfect sense. We've talked about that. And then, we need to have this policies and procedures so that we don't have any kind of accidental distribution of client data where it shouldn't go. All right, how about a final sample question here? Portfolio manager, while discussing the performance of a client's account, she realizes that the client's funds are acquired by a drug cartel. Oh, well, this makes it at least a little bit more of an interesting question. So what should the portfolio manager do? And this is probably an obviously one. Report the client to the authorities. Yep. So look at the explanation down there. Maintain confidentiality unless it relates to illegal conduct. All right. So that takes us through standard 3. Up next is duties to employers, which piggybacks right on our duties to clients. But there's a bunch of other different things in there. I think you'll find those 3 components a fairly interesting conversation. So this is what I want you to do now. Just like I asked you after standard 1, just like I asked you after standard 2, I want you to go to those 30 odd questions at the end of this reading, and I want you to go through them. And feel free to go through them quickly because I'm going to ask you to do this 7 times. And after that 7th reading, you're going to have those 34 questions embedded in your brain. So go ahead and look at those. Remember now, you only have 3 standards, so there's going to be some questions in there that you probably don't know. But I promise you, as we go over these and over these, that these will give you great hints and a great source of a toolbox for the exam. So thank you for watching. Have a great day and good luck studying.